Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're going to get into a really fascinating paradox. How did a movement designed to decolonize knowledge end up getting trapped by the very system it wanted to tear down? To figure this out, we're going to unpack an amazing article by Alfonso Arriaga Juarez. Alright, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the initial promise of change, then we'll uncover this trap of inclusion that came next. We'll dig deep into how it all works, looking at how social control is shifted and how racism functions as a modern technology, before finally exploring a pretty radical path forward, an insurrection of knowledge.
First up, a promise of change. Because, before you can understand how something went off track, you've got to appreciate the power and the hope of its original goal.
And this brings us right to the big question that drives this whole analysis. For decades now, universities have churned out tons of studies on social justice, race, and colonialism. So, why does it feel like the fundamental problems just aren't going away?
The first answer was a brand new way of thinking, transdisciplinary and decolonial studies. Now, the goal here wasn't just to add some new topics to the university course catalog. The goal was to fundamentally dismantle the colonial and racist biases baked into the very structure of modern Western knowledge, to expose what the source calls the dark side of the Enlightenment.
But, and this is a big but, this really promising idea ran into a huge problem. Let's move on to our next section to explore what the author calls the trap of inclusion.
Now, what's so fascinating about this slide is the massive gap between the promise and the reality. These new fields wanted to tear down the old structures, but to get a seat at the academic table, they had to start playing by the old rules. They had to adopt the language and methods of the very disciplines they were critiquing. And in doing that, their radical edge got sanded down, their power got diluted, and what looked like inclusion was really just a new, more subtle form of control.
And this quote from A.M. Vajay just brilliantly nails the heart of the problem. The very act of being included was the trap itself. It's kind of like being invited to join a club on the condition that you stop trying to change its rules. You get a voice, but only if you say what the club already deems acceptable.
So how exactly does this trap work? Well, the article argues that to really get it, we need to see the bigger picture, a massive shift in social control, moving away from punishing bodies and towards managing minds.
This table shows a crucial shift described by the philosopher Michel Foucault. We've moved from what he called a disciplinary society, think prisons, factories, rigid schedules, to a society of control. Here, control is way more fluid. It's less about locking you in a room and more about shaping your choices through things like social media algorithms or corporate wellness programs, encouraging you to regulate yourself. The focus shifts from controlling the process to controlling the outcome.
The old disciplinary model was a really clear sequence. Foucault described it as moving from one institution of confinement to the next. You go from the family, to the school, to the barracks, to the factory. Each space has its own rigid set of rules designed to make you a docile and useful body.
And we can see this exact shift in our own lives, especially in education and work. The old industrial model was all about getting qualifications, a diploma. The process was controlled. But now, in our information age, it's all about developing competencies, flexibility, communication, initiative. The focus isn't on how you learn, but on the results you produce. You're expected to manage yourself, to constantly update yourself, to become your own project manager. That's self-control in action.
Okay, let's connect this back. If society is now based on self-control and managing populations, how does that change the function of racism? The article argues it gives it a new and maybe even more powerful role.
According to the source, we often make the mistake of thinking about racism as just a bad idea or an individual prejudice. But the argument here is that it's something much more structural. It's not just in people's heads, it's built into the systems that manage our lives. So here's the crucial point. In a society of control that's focused on managing the entire population, the health, wealth, and life of the species, racism becomes a technology. It becomes the mechanism the state uses to draw a line through the population, to decide who is valuable and should be protected, and who is disposable and can be left to die. It's a tool for managing life itself.
This timeline shows how Foucault traces this idea. Conflict starts as an open war between different races during conquest. Then, this gets hidden or subsumed into the language of class struggle within a nation. But underneath, a biological split is created, a superrace and a subrace inside the same population.
And eventually, this becomes a global strategy, a way of organizing the entire world.
Okay, so if inclusion is a trap and this new form of control is everywhere, is there any way out? The final section of our source proposes something truly radical.
The proposed path forward isn't to create another academic discipline. It's to adopt what Foucault called genealogy. The source calls it an anti-science, not because it's against facts, but because it's a tactic against the idea of a single, centralized truth. The goal was to spark an insurrection of knowledges, to activate all the local, forgotten, and disqualified forms of knowledge, to challenge the one dominant discourse that claims to have all the answers.
And what powers this insurrection? The recovery of what are called subjugated knowledges. Think about everything that had to be silenced or called unscientific to make way for our current system. It's the knowledge of the patient, not just the doctor. The knowledge of the craftsman, not just the engineer. It's local histories, hidden memories, all the ways of understanding the world that were pushed aside.
And that's where we land. The argument isn't about asking for a seat at the existing table, but about building a whole new one with all the materials that were thrown away. This leaves us with a provocative question. What knowledge has been silenced or labeled illegitimate in your own community, your education, or your life? And what might change if we finally started listening to it?